Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. For those that don't know me yet, my name is Paulina Raniecka, and I am the Research and Communications Coordinator of the ASI Water Security and Justice Cluster and of the Wave Network. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome our speaker for today's session, Heidi Mendoza. Heidi's lecture is opening the third thematic cluster of our webinar series, namely Water-Food Nexus. Our Water Security and Justice webinar series uncovers the concept of water security and water justice through four thematic angles, in particular water conflicts, water scarcity, water food nexus, and water mining nexus. The lecture today will last 45 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. We kindly ask you to put your questions in the chat. And I will now pass on to Dr. Gianpel Delangelo, coordinator and lead of the ASI Water Security and Justice Cluster and the New Wave Network, to introduce our speaker of the day, Heidi Mendoza.
Thank you, Paulina. Hi, everyone. It's a great honor to introduce Heidi, who is a colleague here at IVM. We're very fortunate to have her here working with us. She's a PhD candidate from the Water and Climate Risk and Environmental Policy Analysis groups. And her PhD research focuses on the past and future qualitative storylines of drought to flood events. She's working as part of the Perfect Storm project funded by the EU. And before joining the FU, she was the program coordinator of the Sustainable and Inclusive Landscape Governance implemented by Foundation Philippines, Tropenbos International, and Wageningen University and Research. Her work entailed designing and facilitating inclusive and creative dialogues to bring stakeholders together towards the sustainable management and governance of Sierra Madre in Palawan in the Philippines, and Bukidnon-Misamis Oriental landscapes. She also led collaborative research work on community forest rights and landscape governance assessments. Heidi, thank you so much for being with us. It's a great honor to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gianpel, and thank you, Paulina. I think you can already see my screen, and thank you for the introduction, Gianpel. And I'm really happy to be able to share my work. And I took this opportunity to actually present my previous work in the Philippines and my ongoing work here in Amsterdam and in Peru. And the general storyline of the presentation would be about shedding complexities of living with and without waters, stories from the Philippines and the Peruvian Amazon. Well, Gianpel already gave a nice introduction, but I thought it would be nice to still walk you through how I decided to finally do a PhD after maybe more than 8 years of thinking. So I finished my bachelor's back in 2013. I did development studies and science communication, focusing on agricultural economics in the University of the Philippines, and after which I started my work. And from 2013 to 2018, I was working as a researcher for a climate-smart agriculture in the Philippines, where I was fortunate enough to travel to different areas and really talk and work with a lot of Filipino farmers. And I think at that time, it was when I was most humbled as a researcher, going to the field and trying to see, yeah, this is what the Filipinos would need. Filipino farmers would need new technological advances, early warning system, decision support system, all of these technocratic solutions. And some small conversations would lead you to think about the things you would want to do with farmers. And one of the conversations I had was with a farmer, and he asked me, "You really don't know how to farm, do you?" And at that moment, I thought, yeah, then maybe I would take a step back and try to see how science can be a place and a space where actually other epistemologies, ways of knowing, ways of experiencing can also, yeah, give space for different communities. And then after my master's, I worked in Forest Foundation Philippines. And much of the work that we do there is funded by the US government and some by the Dutch government, specifically by Tropenbos International. And 2 years ago, I started my PhD in Amsterdam. So that it looks linear from the slide, but it has never been linear for me. It has always been a messy, a chaotic journey of going here, doing my PhD. And I just wanted to invite you to 2 things about this story. So I wouldn't call this a presentation, but I would just call this a story where I think one of the most important aspects of the story, not just my story, but the stories of the people I work with, would be the ongoingness nature of arriving at an answer, arriving at a new problem, arriving at in all sorts of aspects. And I guess I'm not here this afternoon to offer and to provide direct solutions, direct answers about water nexus in light of water security, but I would want to invite everyone with me to think along around experiencing the questions we ask. So those are the two things, two important things to bear in mind. Before I take you to Peru, I will bring you back where I come from the Philippines. And I chose this artsy map that we were working on 2, 3 years ago. And some of my colleagues are actually here watching. So hello, magandang umaga. So this project is funded by Tropenbos International. They're a Dutch NGO who supports and funds different forest projects in Southeast Asia, in South America, and different parts of the world. And the project was anchored on the question, how do we bring different stakeholders together who have different development agenda, who have different narratives around forests, around water, around food together and vision together to conserve forests for the future, for different generations to come. In the context of the Philippines, we're a country where we live with danger. And when I say we live with danger, we live with natural hazards such as tropical cyclones, droughts, floods, storm surges, earthquakes, and all of these things. And all of these hazards make the country very vulnerable. But we are also an agriculture dependent country, which means that every time that a hazard would come in any part of the country, it's almost always a norm, or it's almost always the thing that food production and water quality and water quantity will be highly affected. And a lot of our agricultural areas are also planted with rice, both rain-fed and irrigated rice, and both of which are highly dependent on water, highly vulnerable to any hydroclimatic stresses. And at the same time, the Philippines is also home to a lot of lush, a lot of beautiful forests, which are also sources of both water and food for both rural and urban areas. And I stress that enough, for both rural and urban areas, because the stories that we will see today about the Philippines will actually be about the story of water nexus and water trade-off between rural and urban areas in the Philippines. So that's the context of the project, and we facilitated different dialogues, different serious games, and all creative sorts of approaches to bring different stakeholders together, from government, civil society, indigenous communities, even academic sectors, and also private institutions, to really talk about the future that they want. And most of the time, you would think that different people, different stakeholders would want different futures. But I think through this project, we realized that we wanted the same future, at least for some of the forests in the Philippines. It was a matter, it was a question of asking how to get there together. And some of my colleagues are still doing the work that we started back in 2018. And central to the story this afternoon is this image of a bucket. So you can see now in the slide a man rowing a small boat carrying a bucket. But this bucket has a lot of cracks, a lot of holes. And if you think of the bucket as a container of water, a container of food, a container of stories of people, now this afternoon I want us to see the cracks in the bucket, but also not just what are the cracks, what are the known cracks. We also want to ask who suffers from the leakages. Why are there cracks on the bucket? Is it more like a systemic problem? Is it more a financial policy related problem? Why water food nexus is kind of difficult to pursue in the context of Philippine forests or Philippine forest landscapes? And how do we address the cracks? And I also guess more importantly, are there still cracks that we do not know about, or cracks that we cannot just see out of this moment? And specifically, we will be talking about the context of this landscape, Mount Daraitan and Tenipac River landscape in the northern part of the Philippines, where it's a home to different indigenous communities, where they depend on the river for water, for transportation, but also on the forests for food, for sources of livelihood, for sources of different opportunities and capacities. So this photo was taken back in 2018 amid ongoing negotiations between and among stakeholders whether the government can start building a big dam that will traverse some of the important and sacred landscapes within this river and within the forests. And the necessity out of the dam was that in the capital city of the Philippines called Manila, there's a water shortage. So the narrative was that the capital needs water, so we can find other places outside Manila to provide water for Manila. And this was one of the landscapes which was targeted or planned where dams can be built to provide water for the city. However, as I mentioned before, this is home for forest, home for people, home for different types of stories. And it's a sacred home for other types of communities. And so the people that you see in the photo, those are some of the stakeholders who were patient and willing enough to engage in the process of dialogues, the process of negotiation, process of scrutinizing environmental impact assessments, just to see, is there a crack in how we frame the narrative around the dam? Is there a crack in the science? What is science favoring? Is science only favoring urban areas, but why can't it actually highlight the pristine, the biodiversity, the water available from the forest, but also the food that the communities are able to get from the forest? So it was a myriad of different narratives going over time with different stakeholders. And I think at this point, some of the stakeholders you see from the picture are still ongoing the advocacy against the dam. And the pandemic kind of halted the construction. But I think in the past couple of months or even the year, there were still small construction going here and there. So the dam will still be built, I guess, in time. And this is not an academic work. When I was there, it was more of a development project where we engage with academic institutions to really help us bring forth science in the context of water and food and forest conservation. But it was difficult because the issue was highly politicized. In spaces where it's highly politicized, it's kind of difficult even for science to come in and bring certain solutions. And so in the context of the bucket, I want us to ask ourselves that, or think about, even the smallest crack can drain the bucket. And what do I mean with smallest crack? And most of the time in development agenda, forest conservation, or in water agenda, food agenda, we prefer to provide the resources to cities because a lot of people live in the cities, a lot of economic activities happen in the cities, so we have to provide for the cities. However, what happens to rural communities, indigenous communities, rural areas who are also relocated or usually relocated and also not provided with access to water and food? And I put the quotation, even the smallest crack, because I think in the narrative, it's easy to say that these people can be relocated anywhere. They can live anywhere, but they have certain relationships with water, with forest, with land, that probably that's the only landscape that they would feel at home. And the second question around the bucket and around the cracks would be, how might environmental and social safeguards and policies, such as environmental impact statement systems or environmental impact assessments, actually be used to ensure water food nexus and justice for development projects like dams and mining, but the mining aspect will come later on in this series. And I just wanted to end the story by an untitled song shared with me by one of the indigenous communities. He was the chieftain of the tribe. He sang the song in Filipino, in Tagalog, but I translated for you to English, and he was singing, "We are the Dumaga tribe, in the mountains and in the sea coast, always together, with our own families, with nothing to depend on but natural resources. This is an inheritance from our ancestors that were left to us. We are together, we will fight for our inherited land." When I think about water and food, and when I think about justice in the context of water, food, and water security, I bear in mind the people that we tend to usually leave out in favor of other development agendas. So that's an ongoing story. ongoing negotiation back home. And I'm happy that some of my colleagues are still working on the case. A lot of environmental lawyers, a lot of master students, PhDs, NGOs still working on the case. And to support the indigenous people singing this song from their hearts that they matter as well in the water, food discussion and agenda. That's the last project I did back home before I started my PhD. I started my PhD in 2021 thinking I would deal with completely different aspects because the starting or the departure point of my PhD is actually hydroclimatic or hydrological extremes, specifically drought and flood. However, when I did my fieldwork last year and in 2022 in Peru, you see a lot of injustice. At least I saw a lot of injustice in the places that I go to, that I went to. It's a different context, although it's kind of difficult to differentiate the context coming from the Philippines, going to Peru. There was a lot of similarities going on, but I always had to remind myself this is a different context. So now we talk about a different type of crack in the bucket. This is a type of crack that revolves around living without waters because this is the center of the PhD. And I bring you to Peru, to the Amazonian part, to the Peruvian Amazon, where I did my field work in 4 small communities. I did 2 small field work in 2 riverine communities in the city called Belen and Ponchana, then 1 hour, 1.5 hour away from the city by boat. We also went to a small community called Tamshiaku, and then 8 hours further away from the city is a smaller riverine community, El Chino. But for this story, I will present the story that I've heard in Belen and what I mean when I say living without waters and what I mean with water nexus in the context of water access and water justice. Just a bit of visual context. This is Iquitos City. This is the city proper. The city is situated along 3 different rivers, Nanay River, Itaya River, and of course the Amazon River. And out of these rivers, they can only use or extract water from Nanay River for drinking water. And only 30 to 35% of the whole city has access to piped water, and all the rest they would have to buy bottled waters. They would have to buy bottled or buckets of water from their neighbors or from stores. And of course, a lot of riverine communities as well depend on different sources such as rainwater harvesting because it's a tropical rainforest climate. So they have a lot of rainfall that they can harvest, that they can use not directly for drinking, but for cooking, for washing clothes, for maintaining the house. If they want to use the rainwater for drinking, then they would have to treat that using chlorine. And so this is Iquitos, a photo taken by our partner from Peru, Instituto Geofísico del Perú. And also just wanted to show you the smallness, the scale of humans in comparison to the grandness of Amazon River, to the grandness of the Amazon forest. So that was the boat that we used last year to go to the riverine communities farther away from the city. And for this PhD, I use storytelling and narrative approaches for the major reasons that lived experiences and stories are different for each of one. Individuals have different encounters with the river. Maybe some people who have more resources have a different relationship with the river in a sense that they don't have direct dependence on the river as compared to communities who live closer to the river and who treat the river as part of their daily lives, drinking water, transportation, and the river as a means to social services such as school, hospitals, and markets. And stories can expose the cracks that are masked by dominant development narratives and agenda. It's in those small stories, day-to-day stories, that you will see or that I saw that there were stories of injustice embedded just because they were people living close to the water. They were people building houses close to the water. And of course, water and food nexus is a daily story for these people because they would have to find water every day. because water is not a guaranteed resource for these people despite them living close to the river. Food is also kind of difficult as a resource because there are droughts and floods happening, as I will discuss later, and the diet is shifting, and the water resources are becoming more unstable. And it's a daily fight for justice. So here is one of the communities. We went there in 2022 during the dry season. And you will see different types of houses. On the lower right, you will see a floating house. So it's a floating house, and most of the indigenous communities in the Amazon and also close to the city preferred to have floating houses at the time because they would just rise depending on the river level. However, in the past couple of years, the wood has become uh, expensive than usual. So they started building houses on stilts or on posts, which are a bit more difficult to adjust when the river level is higher than their anticipated level. So this is the dry season. Some areas you have to reach by small boats. Some areas you can just walk around. And during the dry season, their dependence or their relationship with water and food is different. During the dry season, they usually farm. So they plant cassava, they plant corn and other crops that they would either sell to the market or eat for the family. And also water source wise, they would have direct access. Some houses would have direct access to potable water. So that's during the dry season. And the dry season usually lasts for 5 to 6 months. And last year when I was there around April, it was the wet season. And the wet season again also lasts for 5 to 6 months, and you will also see different water and food relationships during the wet season or the creciente, or basically the growing of the river. During the wet season, they can still do some farming, although in farther areas where there's a bit more land, fertile land to plant. And some of them would also either do fishing and also be employed in the city, or they would create or they would construct their own boats, and yeah, they would have to charge people if they needed to use the boat. And food wise, this is also the time when food prices start to increase, because then all the people who produce the food from the city or from the forest would have to use boats to deliver it to markets, which increases the transportation cost, or just basically the food cost. And water-wise, this is also the time when they don't have stable access to pipes anymore, because the pipes are submerged with the river. And so most of the families during the creciente or during the wet season would have to buy bottled or buckets of water from their neighbors or from store. So there's a different relationship with water, with food, also different ways of spending money, different ways of living altogether. And I chose to share the story of this community because also, like in the Philippines, this community was somehow marginalized in the context of development planning, because you could imagine how difficult it is to provide appropriate, timely support to the community, just because they're in this constant with and without water, constant uncertainty when the river would rise, when the river would start to decrease. And so the government's response to such uncertainty and complexity was to relocate, or was to plan to relocate them to a different area, 40 kilometers away from the city, which means there's no river, far from the river, because the in the narrative, river is the source of the risk. So they would have to be taken away, taken out of the river, closer to land. However, it's farther from the market, farther from schools and hospitals, and again, farther from their major source of actually living and transportation. Not a lot of people moved to the new relocation area. A lot of them stayed. And last year, when we were talking about this political issue, what they said was that they felt like they did not matter in the planning stage just because they don't contribute economically to the city, just because they're people who live by the river. But then again, we have to bear in mind that in the Amazon, it's a different context. It's not just a rural area. It's not just a peri-urban area, but it's in the context of the farthest area to any land that you can see. And also, it's a jungle area. It's a forest area, and people might have different relationships with food and water. And the normal gridded planning or urban planning might not actually pan out for certain communities because they have different epistemic and ontological relationships with the nature and environment around them. And contrary to what the government thinks about the creciente or the growing of the river and the drying of the river Vaciante, the creciente Vaciante, the wet season and the dry season actually is a source of water and food security at some point for communities. So, based on the interviews I did last year, we constructed this annual cycle of the river. This would be the normal cycle of the river. So, from around November to May, they would have a creciente, which means people would have to go on boats, people would have to fish, and around May to October, or sometimes it spills over November, December, then it would be the dry season when they would have to change their sources of livelihoods again. But we also try to categorize what a drought looks like in certain contexts when there's always dryness and wetness. We also try to categorize what a flood looks like in certain cases. But I want to point the story to the reality and to the finding that the changing hydroclimatic patterns and river dynamics in that area, Lower Belen, challenge stakeholders' relationship with water and their mechanisms to produce and distribute food. For example, communities and their livelihood. So they would really have to change. And without a complex, comprehensive understanding of what really happens during such wetness and dryness, it's difficult for then governments to make decisions. It's also then more complex for water service providers to actually design certain water provisioning equipment, mechanisms, and their ability to respond. If the water pipes have been submerged for too long, then it would take more money, more finances, more planning to respond and to make sure that the water is available and accessible to communities. And again, in comparison to the dominant development narrative and agenda, communities' relationship with water and food is much more complex because sometimes this dryness and wetness, they're able to turn this into capabilities and to opportunities. And these types of living with and without water are usually silenced or marginalized in the context of water uh, and food agenda. As I've said, this is an invitation to ongoing experiencing um, the questions. We're still 1.5 years away to finish the project, and we're still working with the communities and really trying to plot out the relationships, different dynamics of drought and flood, and how that affects food and water, and how that affects in general what justice and injustice would look like for a certain community. And here I would just point all of us into water food nexus amid living without waters. And I bring us back again to the bucket, although here in this sketch it's not the bucket. This is the water tank that the community has. It's been not functioning for the past couple of years. So would like to point you to the framing and addressing cracks in the bucket. What are the cracks? Again, what are the cracks really? Is it more of a drought and flood problem only? That's why people have difficulties. That's why people have to be relocated. And who gets to frame the cracks? If only the government and if only other institutions within the government are able to frame the crack, it would always or somehow always be that certain epistemologies or certain ways of living with river are marginalized and they can always be just taken out of their context. And I guess much more important question for further research or for researchers in the group, how do we understand the nature of the cracks? It's a mix of both. Is it more hydroclimatic, more sociopolitical, or a mix of everything? And then if it's a mix of everything, then what would justice look like? Where would justice enter in these kinds of conversations? But then again, also the issue of epistemic injustices, I would say, are the core of excluding vulnerable communities who bear the responsibility of providing food, both in the context of the Philippines and Belen in Iquitos City. yet who are the last to be provided with safe and stable access to water. And I would end with a field poem I wrote last year. So I documented my field work through poems, and this was one of the poems I wrote last year while walking with the communities we were working with. I walk until the end. Is there an end? And will I keep walking without end? But I am not complaining because I like walking, because I can see many streets and many faces, because I can feel emotions, those that I cannot feel if I close my eyes, if I close my senses, those that I cannot feel if I stay inside. These days I walk on waters without fears, only a heart for an equal tomorrow. So I wrote this in Spanish. That's why the words are very much simple. I was trying out my Spanish when I was there. But I would like to end with this slide just to thank my colleagues from the Philippines and ongoing projects there. I'm really happy that my colleagues are still treading the negotiations, really working with communities, and also working very patiently with governments and private institutions. And of course, would like to thank the project partners from Peru. We're working with Climate Center, Instituto Geofísico del Peru, and another university, University of Technology and Engineering in Lima. And of course, all of these stories, all of these fieldwork insights are part of my PhD project, Perfect Storm, from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And you have my email, so if you have questions or further provocations, I'm happy to engage. And I have two friends with me in the room, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. This was such a beautiful lecture and a very nuanced approach, so to say, to a seminar. So I really appreciated that. It felt very personal, and that's much appreciated. A bit to switch up the busy days that we all are having over here. So we're gonna open the Q&A now. And there's already a first question in the chat. Just for the audiences, you can use indeed the regular chat. There's also the Q&A chat. I will be looking at both of them, but feel free to use the regular one. So the first question is about the practicalities of your research, specifically how you found working with local communities, how that experience was for you. Do you speak Spanish? Did you have to use a translator? Could you reflect on the process a little bit and share that with us?
Yeah, I think that was a long process. The first time I went there in 2022, I did not speak Spanish. But then when I did my scoping, I was with my local researchers at that time. And when I went back last year, I was speaking technical Spanish. And I would say technical Spanish because this would be the words around river, droughts and floods, food, water. So it's a very certain vocabulary around Spanish, I would say. And I was working with local researchers from a university in Iquitos. They were biologists and foresters, and I think it was a learning experience for us because they've been living there for a long time. And every Friday of the week, we would have a debrief. And they would always say, "I've been living here my whole life, but I never knew that people in Belen have to live this way." And I think that was for the group, at least also for me, was really an eye-opener that even for communities who are already living there, certain lifestyles, certain ways of living are just invisibilized. Was it difficult to connect? And I've been doing my field works for a long time since I was doing my bachelor's, but I would say connecting with communities is one of the most humbling and most enriching part of research because I do my research mostly in rural areas, and these are the people who would open themselves, who would open their stories with you, and sometimes to a point that you would be, how do I handle this story with justice? How do I handle all of these stories more than an academic manner? And I guess that's my struggle as a PhD, that I get to entangled with these questions of how do I handle people's lives, people's stories, and not just put it in a theoretical framework, not just put it in a box, but also presenting the complexity of how they live with droughts and floods, for example, or how they live with a proposed dam in the Philippines. So yeah, does that
Thank you
answer
so
the
much.
question?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Perhaps we can build on this theme of working with communities. There's a question about working with community members and, emphasizing that very often there are situations where very crucial and affected communities are not involved in those processes. And is there a way that we could include them in this participatory decision and planning when it comes to water issues? Is there something that perhaps you saw in your work or some ideas that you might have for increasing these participation levels?
Yeah, for this question, I would be speaking mostly from my experiences from the Philippines. So the project was really grounded on this need that there needs to be a multi-stakeholder participatory or participation platform, and that's why we use dialogues. And when I say dialogues, it's really a dialogue because you never know where it goes. We just had to be creative, and I think it was a double-edged sword because on one end, so we did like stakeholder scanning in order to identify which stakeholders are usually marginalized or not included in certain decision making, and we would then be really happy if they could join the dialogues, but at the same time also scan for power. For example, in a certain landscape, who gets to make the decision, most decision, who gets to fund most things. So these types of dynamics, excuse me, we had to take into consideration and bring all of these different stakeholders with different agenda, different power in the landscape together. Sorry. We have some materials for this, more practically or more practical wise, how to arrange a dialogue, how to design a dialogue. I guess for our case, because we tackled very political issues like forest conservation, illegal logging, construction of a dam, we tried to democratize the dialogues by using games, using interactive mapping, using role playing, and using foresight. The foresight processes were just exploratory, really asking most of ourselves, what do we see in terms of forest cover? What do we see in terms of forest conservation work in the Philippines 5 years, 10 years from now? And we did this per group. And before the foresight, there was a cloud of distrust, a cloud of non-collaboration among, for example, communities and governments, because the government, of course, is always at the forefront of decisions being made, be it for the communities or against the communities. But after the grouping exercises, then we had to share the visions, we had to share what we wanted, what they wanted, and then the NGOs realized that at some point they actually want the same things, but through different manners, different languages, different jargons, different mechanisms. But then how do we bring them together was the next question. And I thought at that time that was really a nice realization for the group. Then we can start working together because it's difficult to bring a multi-stakeholder participation or platform going if the members in the platform don't trust each other or don't believe in the vision of the others. And I thought at that moment that was a low-hanging fruit, and I think the group is still ongoing with the dialogues. um, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting to hear also about your experience and specific cases. And I'm just having a look for a nice segue. But I was thinking of staying within the realm of different tools and methods because there's a question about using stories and creative approaches in your research, and if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on this experience, how did you come up with this, and how is that helping you further your research?
Sorry, I did not get the middle of the question.
So if you could just tell us a little bit more about the use of your stories and creative approaches in your research, how that's helping you develop your trajectory or research.
Oh, for the PhD, it has helped me a lot because I started my PhD, and I think for most PhDs, this is how it works. You start the PhD, there's a project. And then you start the PhD with drought to flood in mind. Then I go there. And the first thing, which was difficult because I thought that my supervisor would say, "Then why did you choose this case study? Because people don't talk about droughts and flood. They're like, there's no flood, there's no drought. What's a drought? What's a flood?" And then I thought, maybe I'm asking the wrong questions. Maybe I'm using the wrong word. So it was a challenge of semantic, a challenge of bringing out experiences with the water. Because as they've said, well, there's always water. So why would there be a drought? What would the drought look like in such context? So I guess engaging in storytelling methods, and the questions are also very open. So we talked about day-to-day lives. What would you do in the morning? Where would your wife or your husband be in the morning when you would be staying at home? Who does this type of job? Where do you get the water? Um, so in that sense, people felt a bit more free in thinking about their relationship or their lives with the water. Sometimes it did not come easy because I thought if you live with the waters, it's easy to talk about the river. It's easy to talk about the dryness and the wetness. But what I see from the data analysis, or yeah, from one of the analysis I'm working on, is that as they live with the dryness and wetness, or with and without waters, it becomes more difficult to tell a story of dryness and wetness that's so distinct from each other. Because at some point in the memory, it all becomes an average. They would only remember certain extreme floods like 2012 because that really washed away a lot of houses. But floods that are a bit more calm would be difficult to tell a story about. And I also guess storytelling was difficult because if someone asks you about anything in your life, in your PhD for the first time, even if you know that it's there in your mind, it's difficult to turn it into a story. And if you turn it into a story, there would have to be an event, a person, a response. There has to be action in the story. And during the interviews, that came out a lot that people did not mm, tell a straight story. It was more of a circular story. It was more of, let me go back to that memory because now I can make sense. That's why I did that. So I guess giving them the freedom as well to make sense of their experiences with the river helped both of us in trying to explore the concept. Uh, yeah, I would say that's
Perfect.
how
Thank
it's.
you so much. Yeah, that was a nice reflection, and perhaps we can stay on the thought of this maybe non-mainstream approaches, because there is a question about how we can include necessities that are not quantifiable. So specifically, one of the participants is saying that you pointed out very nicely that necessities specifically of indigenous people are often not of economic nature, but rather relating to quality of their lives and traditions. And that's what's not necessarily given importance on the wider political scene. So is there a way where we could assign a fair and just value to these necessities outside of this purely economic calculation? So are there certain non-mainstream, so to say, a bit, different ways of looking at those kind of values and including them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Uh, so for the work that I do in Peru, I use capabilities approach. Um, well, actually, it stems from economists talking about. But this economist actually realized that it's not always quantifiable. It's not always a matter of economic gains or losses. It's not a matter of always, if you redistribute a certain resource equally to people, then people would have equal means of living, because people need different things. People need different amounts of things. And so basically, what the capabilities approach says is that uh, it's a matter of looking how people are able to use the resources and use these resources to turn it into capabilities. And I frame capabilities in my research as the living without waters, that they're able to shift livelihoods, that they're able to relate with water. And I do not romanticize these types of living in no point, because this is not the point. The point is that governments would have then or even maybe local national government, civil society would then need to have a complex understanding of such capabilities. And the timing, well, specifically for my case study, I'm arguing that it's the timing of the month that the government is very critical when they would need to provide appropriate support, for example, for providing more water, providing more food. If, for example, people are expecting a drought or expecting a longer dry season, but all of a sudden there's a flood, then this is the time when the government comes in very useful and very critical in ensuring that the capabilities of the people to live with the flood would be ensured. Could be providing more water, providing more resources to construct boats or to construct higher houses. And so I would say that's one approach that helped me really put the different qualitative stories and different ways of living without just looking at economic means. Because if you look at economic means, I don't think the community would then have an argument against the government because they're not the major producers of, for example, of cassava. Because the major producers of cassava are in another place. They mostly do small farming. So if the argument will always be how much do you produce and how much do you contribute, these communities would never have a seat at the table. But these are the communities who've been there. And I guess that's difficult. Policy making wise, it's always difficult because at the policy level, you would have to be rational. You would have to make decisions here and there without necessarily having to without having necessarily to understand the complexity um, of the context and of the situation. And that's, I would then circle back to the work in the Philippines because I saw the value of multi-stakeholder platforms. There was no talk about economic contributions because the people back home did not only see forests as economic resource. They saw forests as home. They saw forests as a place to take care of. So in terms of leveraging for policies, more than economic gains from the forest, it was really protecting the quality of life that the forest can provide to the communities within the forest, but also in the downstream. So there's no flood. We don't need to construct bigger dams, these types of things. But it's a more complex understanding, I would say, but would necessitate the presence of the people who are actually there, speaking for themselves, showing what value might a resource have other than economic value.
Thank you so much, Heidi. There's also a question about justice, so specifically about epistemic justice. So perhaps, yeah, we can have a little reflection about ways of looking and just relating to knowledge and access to information. And the question asks specifically, how could or should epistemic justice look like in your opinion? So when you reflect on your cases, what would be the role of epistemic justice there? Or is there space for it?
The first thing is how might it look like? I would say it would look differently in different contexts, but how it might look like, I think first is the recognition that such differences exist, because you cannot give justice to certain things that you don't acknowledge in the first place. If you do not acknowledge that a certain group of people, a certain community actually has an important epistemic knowledge, important epistemic being, then it's just difficult to give them importance, give them a sense of seat or value in the discourse of justice. So I would say I would start with that. But how that would look like, I always liked what our partners back home would say: nothing about us without us. So in this global context of climate change, it's easy to romanticize indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of living. But if you look at it, who gets to say their story, who gets to tell their stories? It's still different organization with certain development agendas. But we rarely, at least, even the Philippines, we rarely hear what they actually need, what they actually want, how they suffer, how they're being affected by certain hazards, by certain policy implications. So I would say epistemic justice would look like for me is for them to be there. And because if I were to represent them, I already have my own biases as a researcher, as a Filipino, as someone working here in Amsterdam. And that would mean before they can get there, you would have to empower the people to be there, because it's easy to assume that if you put people in the table, that they would start talking. But maybe they don't know even that their rights exist, that the indigenous people rights exist, that they can fight for their lands and for their waters. So it's an acknowledgement of the importance, the presence and importance of different epistemic ways of being, ways of living. And also, once you acknowledge that, then you would have to empower these people of their rights, of their responsibilities as well. And they would have to be there. Well, when I say they would have to be there, not everyone, but a select group, I guess, people whom the community trust, people whom the community feel safe that will fight for them. Yeah, that's, I think, how it would look like, at least for the case of the Philippines, Philippine communities I work with in Peru as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And there's also a question, a general question about the effects of climate change on water resources in the two sites that you're looking at. And perhaps if I could add to this, are you also expecting an increased resistance in those areas? So not only the effect on water resources, but perhaps also on local mobilizations or the socio-cultural changes. Is that something that you could foresee, you could see happening in the near future?
So in the context of the Philippines, well, I guess for both cases, it's always either it will become too dry or too wet, and that's what we see in the context of Peru, in Belen. So we see years that the dry season is longer than usual, which means they cannot fish, they cannot use the boats. If they would have to go to the hospital, then it would just take a bit longer. Or too wet, because there were also some years that the wet season was longer than usual. And I think this is the difficulty of dealing with the changing hydroclimatic patterns. It's always at the two ends of the extreme, either too wet or too dry. And when this happens, it's kind of difficult to say. 2 weeks ago, we were in a meeting with a Brazilian researcher doing hydrology work in Brazil, and he was basically saying that none of the modelers, none of the hydrologists in Brazil was able to forecast the ongoing drought in Brazil. And as modelers and scientists, they were asking themselves, what did we miss? And I guess that's also the difficulty of seeing things outside our norm, seeing things outside our lived experiences, that it's difficult to imagine, it's difficult to foresee. And I think also both in Peru and the Philippines would be the same. Maybe in the Philippines you would have more storms, stronger storms. I would fear for stronger storms back home. In terms of more communities rising and organizing, the Philippines was freed and was grounded upon revolution. And so that never stops. It never stops. It continues. People lose, people win, and we continue. They continue. And so I would say it will continue to, people would continue to organize, self-organize, and negotiate with the government, with private organizations against a dam, against mining, against all other things that would hurt where they live. In Peru, I see a different type of fight. It's more formal because some of the communities who did not have access to water before, they filed a lawsuit against the government. And so it was a more formal route of asking for the rights, asking for justice. And just a few months ago, one of the communities who did not used to have access to safe water will now be provided with access to water because of the persistent lawsuit pursued by the community leaders. So I would say communities would continue to resist. It depends on whose ears would listen to the fights, or to the not complaints, to to what people have to say.
Thanks. That was really beautiful. I think that's a really beautiful note to end at. So I would love to really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your time, both to the speaker but also to the audience. Thank you for sharing your experiences, Heidi, your expertise, and thank you for answering all the questions and having the patience with us